Have you ever tasted shapes, smelt sounds, or do you see colours when you read letters of the alphabet? In today's episode of Idioms of Normality on Future Framed TV, I speak with Professor Anina Rich, who has spent a career looking at a phenomenon known as synesthesia, and she brings some really fascinating perspectives to bear upon the question, what is normal? Professor Anina Rich, thank you so much for joining us for an episode of Idioms of Normality. The first question, which is always the same question, is what is normal?
I think normal is what you're used to.
So we can become very used to a new normal very quickly. And I think the recent events with COVID-19 have really illustrated how adaptable humans are.
And certainly some aspects of that are incredibly tough, but people adapt and you become used to a certain type of normal. And anytime your perspective changes or you're confronted by something new, that is perhaps not normal to start with. As you get to know someone or as you understand their perspective more, then you accept it and it becomes normal. So
the normal is changing, it's shifting, it's the circumstances that are around us.
Yeah, I think it's the internal representation of what we're experiencing around us, if we experience it enough.
You also said that it changes and there's a bit of resistance sometimes to change, to discomfort of when the normal changes.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking, when I was thinking about your question, about situations where, for example, you might never have met someone from a particular country who looks a particular way, or someone of a particular sexual orientation. And if you've never had that experience before, perhaps it's a bit odd to start with. And you get to know that person and you realise that actually that then becomes part of your normal, and you realise that it's completely fine, right? The first time you go to Mardi Gras might be a bit confronting. And then if you've gone to Mardi Gras for 10 years, it's something that's absolutely part of your context.
Do people forget the old normal, do you think? Like when you become accustomed to a new situation, to a new world, and as your world expands, do you sometimes forget what it was like when your world was a little bit more closed or different?
Yeah, I think, but unless you reflect on it, I think probably people do. They forget that what they perceived as normal was very different. But I mean, I'm even thinking like, if we talk about what kids are experiencing and where they are, depending on where you grow up, your context of what is completely normal will be very different to somebody else's experience of what's completely normal.
What I'm hearing a lot of is that normal is about context. Can normal be inside the person as well? Can a person be normal, or is it the circumstances that are normal?
I guess I was thinking about it in terms of normalised experience. I wouldn't like to define a person as being normal or not normal, because I think there's such a wide variety of what a person is and can be, and that changes over time as well. So my research area, one of the things that I study is a phenomenon called synesthesia. Synesthesia is a phenomenon, sometimes called a mixing of the senses, but it can be within one sense as well, which I describe as an extraordinary experience to an ordinary stimulus. So for instance, a sound might not just be auditory, but also have a colour or a texture or a movement. Smells might be coloured. Visual images tend to come up quite a lot in synesthesia. The most common version, I think, is probably where graphene is called graphene colour synesthesia, where letters and numbers evoke a vivid experience of colour. Tends to be highly consistent. So if A evokes a particular red experience, then it's the same red experience over time. Every time that person sees, hears, thinks about A, the letter A, it's not voluntary. So it's something that people just have and experience. Now, when somebody hears about synesthesia for the first time, they're often like, wow, that's really unusual. That's perhaps abnormal. But it's not abnormal in the sense that it's perfectly normal for that person, and it's just a way of perceiving the world. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is that in synesthesia, it's a really nice illustration of the fact that we all perceive the world in a particular way that's influenced by our context, by our neural structures and our experience. And in synesthesia, it highlights the fact that you never know that you can't verify that somebody else sees the world in the same way as you do. With synesthesia, you start using language to describe things and you realise, oh, this person has Blue Tuesday. I have no idea what that is like, right? But actually, you and I looking at a particular colour, there's no way we can know that we're actually seeing the same thing, right? We use a label to say this plate is light blue because we've learnt that experience that I'm having when the wavelengths of light reflect when my brain constructs colour is called light blue. But actually, I have no way of knowing if what you're experiencing when you see this plate is like what I experience.
How do I know that a blue for me is not a yellow to you? Yeah,
right.
I see.
When you have a big difference like that, language would usually outline the difference, right? You say to me that's like a yellow, then I would know it. But if we label it the same, the internal experience could be completely different.
So someone with synesthesia, it's just fascinating. Someone with synesthesia, when they're telling you about their experiences, they have letters of the alphabet that correspond to certain colours in the most common form of synesthesia. What's it like when they talk about the experience of finding out for the first time that no one else around them is experiencing that colour association for that letter?
Yeah.
Are they uncovering something about their normality or their abnormality or their difference?
It's interesting, with synesthesia there tends to be sort of two histories. One is, as you described, not realising that other people don't have this and then finding out. So people often will say that they've just heard about synesthesia and I don't understand, how can other people not do this? Isn't this just the way you see? What do you see when you see the letter A? And I'm like, oh, I don't really see the letter A. Okay, but what about when you think about it? I'm like, capital A, 3 sticks. But what's the colour? It doesn't have a colour. So for them, actually, I'm having it, right? And then the other history is sadder, and thankfully it's happening much less often because I think there's a lot more information about synesthesia, about it not being a disorder or anything abnormal, actually, just an unusual in the sense that only a few people in every 100 have it, is that they mentioned something about their colours, usually early on, and were ridiculed for it or told that they were crazy or, in some way had a negative reaction from people around them who didn't do this. And so they've never told anyone since. So one of the most powerful experiences I had during my PhD was I'd done a Radio National interview on synesthesia, and I had a phone call from a woman who was in her 80s, and she said to me, I listened to your interview and I'm just blown away because for 70 years I've kept my colours a secret because I said something about the green woman down the street and I was told that's crazy talk, you'll be locked up, and so I haven't spoken about them for 70 years. And now to know that it's not a disorder, it's not something that indicates that I'm in some way abnormal, it's just a different part of the dimension of human experience.
Yeah.
She didn't quite put it like that, but that's kind of, that was a really powerful message that said we need to be really open to understanding that perception is inherently subjective.
Yeah.
And so from my perspective, I will think that what I see is the right way. But actually, of course, everybody perceives things differently. And I think synesthesia is a really important reminder of that. So those two histories kind of are the way people experience it.
Yeah, there's so much richness in that story because on one hand, you've got people who are asserting their own sense of normality onto other people to the point that a person fears being locked away for something that seems completely benign. So she hasn't hurt anyone with
Absolutely.
Her perception
just for being different.
Just for having a colour association that other people didn't seem to have, and they then labelled her and then were asserting their own sense of what it meant to be normal upon her, but also other people of that ilk. And I think synesthesia sounds like a really great case study for thinking about normality to my mind, because it doesn't sound like you would call it a brain disorder.
No, absolutely not. And I think that's a really important point to make. It is something that happens in a few % of the population, and we don't know exactly how many, because actually often that people don't realise they have synesthesia, or rather they don't realise that synesthesia is something that other people don't have. They don't realise there's a term for it. I think of it as a part of the dimension of of human experience. So, there's some people who think that days of the week, whenever they think of particular day of the week, it has a colour. Now, whether you call that synesthesia or not, if they don't have it for anything else, is a matter of debate.
Okay.
There's some people who don't think in colour at all, like me. I'm very verbal, as you may have noticed.
Right.
And not,
Me too.
I don't think in images. But there's, and then there's, I think, this whole dimension of your internal world. The interesting thing about synesthesia is that there's the realm of difference, I guess, is that there's a conscious experience of colour. So it's not just, I think Wednesdays could be blue. It's Wednesday is fundamentally blue, and how could you possibly not see it otherwise, right? And so one of the interesting things that you asked before about, what about when people, I think you said, find that someone else has a different colour pairing. One of the really nice things is with the synesthesia research is we have feedback events. So because our research depends critically on people being willing to come and give up their time and do our experiments so that we can learn more about synesthesia and the brain in general, we try to have events where we invite all the participants to come back in and we tell them about the results of the research. And I think they appreciate hearing about the results of the research, but actually the most fun bit for people seems to be meeting other synesthetes.
Right.
So unless they have synesthetes in their family, so there really does seem to be a biological link somewhere, in the sense that you're more likely to have, if you have synesthesia, you're likely to have a family member who also has synesthesia.
Right.
Lots of people don't, right? So it's not by any means 100% penetrance or anything like that, but maybe a predisposition to develop synesthesia. And so some families know all about it, and they, talk at dinner about the fact that they've got different colours and so on.
Okay.
But often they're people who haven't met somebody else who's got synesthesia before. And so at these feedback events, typically there's a bit of discussion about the research, a lot of discussion about what colour is your Wednesday and so on.
Right.
And that shared sort of feeling that we're different, and yet here's somewhere where we're the same and they're different.
Yeah. Do they have debates over, no, Wednesday is chartreuse?
I don't know about debates. I think people tend to be pretty open to the idea that other people might have other colours. One thing that is interesting from that perspective, though, is quite often, we get people in the lab who are perhaps grapheme colour synesthetes. So they experience colours from letters and digits, words, and so on. And then they ask about other forms of synesthesia. And we also have done some studies with olfactory synesthetes and auditory visual synesthetes.
So olfactory synesthetes, people who smell?
So when they smell things, they have particular
Colours.
experiences that the rest of us don't have.
Okay.
So usually visual, but usually more complex than just a colour.
Right.
And the graphene colour synesthetes who don't have olfactory synesthetes, well, that's weird.
Oh, really?
Right? So there's this whole sense in which whatever you're not used to is not within your normal.
Yeah.
And then you become used to it and you're like, actually, to me, olfactory synesthesia doesn't seem unusual. Like, it's unusual in the sense that it doesn't occur very often, but it's not abnormal.
It sounds like there's a
difference there.
It sounds like there's a shortcoming in our vocabulary, because it's not, the way that person might be using the word weird is not necessarily in a negative sense.
Right.
It's just, like you said, unusual, and it seems like the word normal here is perhaps very ill-fitting and unhelpful to talk about people as normal. And I think this is maybe going back to your first point, perhaps why you felt more comfortable about talking about experiences that you were accustomed to, that were familiar as being somewhat normal, as opposed to putting the seed of normality into a person.
You're right. I think I feel very uncomfortable with the idea of describing normal as being something relating to a person or not. I don't understand how we could define something as, like, I don't want to say this is somebody who's normal and this is somebody who's not normal, because to me that's like, I don't want to do that at all.
Yeah.
I feel very uncomfortable with that notion.
It sounds like you're uncomfortable because it's nonsensical, but also discriminatory. And
and it's not being, it's not allowing anything that's outside your experience. I think that's one of the major problems in terms of systemic injustices and discrimination that we have, is that people are like, well, this is normal, and anything outside that has nothing to offer and is really categorically different. And I think I guess I feel more comfortable with talking about normality as being what you're used to, because I do think it can change, and I think that it really is what your experience has been and shouldn't be thought of as fixed.
Yeah. And, going back to what the 8-year-old lady called you up on the phone said, fear of being locked away, the way in which people, I think we could possibly even problematise putting the word normal onto circumstances because of the way in which people put boundaries around the circumstances that they are familiar with and having that are accustomed to. The way in which people say, this is my normal, I'm going to resist change and I'm going to put boundaries around it.
Yeah.
If I was to flip the tables for a moment and finish off the interview with you being the interviewer, hypothetically.
I like that sound of that.
But what questions do you think we, collectively, should be asking about normality and what is normal?
I'd like to know what people think about how we can change normal, how you can make challenging the normal a comfortable, positive thing, rather than something that people get defensive about and resist.
I love that. How can we change normal? And how can you make challenging normality something comfortable and
positive?
And positive. Yeah.
So I think of all of the scenarios or situations where there are people being discriminated against because of some difference. And really, coming from a position of really privilege in a lot of ways, I like to find ways where I can try and be an ally to that. So whether you think about, LGBTQ plus communities, whether you think about skin colour, whether you think about, non-English speaking backgrounds in science, all of these situations are situations where I am in the privileged category of not having to deal with that discrimination. But by allowing myself to understand that normal isn't just what I've got, I think you have more openness to being willing to see what happens when that is not your normal, and try and be an ally and use your privilege to actually make a difference, to make other people more open to the idea that normal might be something different from what they have.
Wow.
I don't know if that really made any sense.
I know it absolutely makes sense, and I just I really want to take that message and spread it, and hopefully more people can think like Professor Anina Rich, because that's a really valuable perspective on the world, and I think one that's much more inclusive. And thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
And we'll take those questions home, I think, just to return to them again. The questions of how do we change the normal, and how do we challenge it and turn that challenging normal into a positive experience. Thank you very much.
Thanks.